Button. Don't be looking.
I went through, first of all, I think there are actually two things that need to be considered. One is the proposed, as you'll recall, I had written a letter to the congressman, and now Janine Bauer has written a letter. So as I understand it, she would like the township to send that letter with the grant application, is what I'm understanding. In the grant application, the comments that I had were, this price tag in paragraph 6 of $2,704,306 for the rehabilitation is 7 years old. And even without the inflation that we're suffering, that's obviously a very stale number. And so while it says the cost estimate is being updated due to inflation and the passage of time, which I'm sure it is, if we're asking for a grant, if the township's asking for a grant, I would think that it would need to have a better figure. Then over on, I guess it's the third page, in paragraph 12, at the top of the third page, where it talks about the township adopting a resolution affirming the agreement to accept ownership, inspection, and maintenance responsibility in an as-is condition. The sentence goes on to say the township is currently determining the information to be able to accept the bridge. Seems to me that the township is currently determining the information to be able to determine whether to accept the bridge. Now, and then at the end of that paragraph, it says whether the township will be able to secure funding to perform the rehabilitation. I had put and future maintenance because the township's accepting the obligation to rehabilitate, inspect, and maintain. I don't know whether the township thinks that including that language is appropriate. Then in the next paragraph, at the end of the paragraph, it says the township has engaged the services of Doug Bond, PE, an engineer who previously worked with the Delaware Riverkeeper Network on the Headquarters Road Bridge to prove the feasibility of the rehabilitation option during the NEPA process. I think it's really, he's worked on the Headquarters Road Bridge to determine, rather than prove, to determine the feasibility. And then the other comment that I had is at the end of the response to paragraph 13, it says, we believe this project can be completed within the project period. I don't think anybody has any idea of what the project period is. So I'm not sure the township can say that. Those were the sort of the comments that I had concerning it. I will have to say that I thought it was sort of a strange grant request. I mean, it doesn't even seem to require the township's signature. But be that as it may, those were my comments.
All right. Thank you, Steve. I guess I'll go on with some. I mean, I looked this up. I don't know. I'm sure you guys have tried to look this up too. So the EDI funding seems to be from like HUD, which there is not a whole lot on the website on. Actually, there's no application currently for 2024 and beyond. There is a link on the website to, if you have been chosen for 2023 funds, about some details regarding the program, and they are different rules or notes than if you were accepted for 2022's funding program, which gives me a little bit concerned. I guess the details are what it will really make this. I had also concerns about the dollar value, Steve, and then also the comment about the project time frame, because again, without any details about what the rules and regulations are with regards to the money, if we were to be granted it and what all that involves, it's hard to say, what that would be, because it does clearly state in this application that we do not have permits, even though that there was a in kind, the PennDOT's original design went through the process. This new design would have to go through its own process and does not therefore have any current permits. So between that design and construction, if there is a time frame associated with this grant, I mean, depending on what that is, we may or may not be able to
Yeah,
fulfill that.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I noted the reference to the quote project period, whatever the heck that is.
I mean, I guess on the other side of things, applying for a grant that it seems like maybe this isn't the intention of that funding program in its core, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't get chosen. So applying, I guess the other question to discuss today would be applying for this, is there any harm in applying? And I guess that sort of goes with the details. If we did apply, we did get accepted. And then we find out in the details at some point that we can't accept it, is there some drawback or penalty or issue with that? Or does that potentially put a negative light on us from applying for future federal monies or state monies?
Well, as we sort of learned with PEMA, they don't like to give the money. They don't like it when somebody turns down a grant and gives it back. So I don't think that there's any limitation on your ability to decline the grant, even if it's granted. And I did think that the question that Terry raised about whether there is matching funds was very important. And apparently the answer is that there are no matching funds, which is certainly an important issue.
You mean there's no matching funds
Required
with
from the
regard to
township.
the grant application? There's
Exactly.
none required.
That's correct.
Right. So this is a suggested grant application, so we can change it if we want,
Yeah.
if we elect to do that. We can include some of the concerns about the cost being a little light. We can also take out or include, if we want, a longer period of time. I'd also like to hear what, Steve, you reviewed this. Have you any thoughts on this?
Well, use your mic, I guess. I think my thoughts were similar to Steve Harris. We talked about this earlier today. And the costing and where the estimates came from was an issue, and the timeline. And the fact of the feasibility that's still somewhat outstanding. Otherwise, I had comments similar to Jim, Mr. Helms, on not seeing the grant documents to know what the parameters of the program are. Most of them usually require resolution or some kind of motion to approve signature of grant paperwork and submit it to a government agency. So I haven't not had the time to try to dig into it, other than I did get to the same website I think you did, and
There's not a whole,
didn't have another link
there's not a whole.
to get to the paperwork end of it.
Steve, can I ask you, what is the downside to this? I mean, there is no document that requires our signatures at this point. This is just to get the ball rolling, the way I'm reading it, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well,
So I don't see where the downside is.
I don't see the downside, but I do think that some of those clarifications that I mentioned do need to be made. That,
Right.
we're determining whether to accept, the township's determining whether to accept the bridge and determining the feasibility. And I think those clarifications, and as far as the letter that the Riverkeeper's lawyer drafted, I didn't see anything in there that bound the township to certain action.
So that's what we're talking about. If we made changes to the suggested grant application that we have in front of us, but if we made those changes that we're concerned about, what's the downside? Again,
I don't think there is one.
thank you.
So I guess that then, like, one of the biggest things on this would be then, what would we be comfortable with regards to, the request of monies? Because I guess if we were to get something of this size, I think the township will be hopeful, and that would cover the cost of hopefully the rehabilitation as a whole. One of the concerns that I would have is if we, a project in this type, we could be getting close, but if we get to a point in the project and we have a certain amount of monies and we run into issues, you know, as we get into foundations and whatnot, that, you know, none of those issues will be light dollar value. And if we've tore the bridge apart to a certain level and don't have, you know, I guess worst case scenario money, I think the township would be hard pressed to, you know, say like, okay, we don't have the money, we're just gonna stop and leave the bridge in more disarray than it was
Well, and
previously. That's my main concern.
And
And then
that,
we'd have to be on the hook for, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars to try to, if you ran into an issue of that, they're all gonna be high dollar issues.
well, and that raises, I mean, there's another issue that is important to consider in that regard. And that was I think it's in Steve's email from PennDOT that, you know, PennDOT saying, okay, you want to dig around the footings and all that kind of stuff, but you're taking the risk of if there's any damage to the abutment, or it fails for any reason, that's on you, i.e. the township. That's also, I think, a significant concern. Who knows
I mean, how much,
what's going to happen? They're talking about digging a trench, as I understand it, 10 feet wide, 20 feet long. I don't know how deep.
exposing the backside of.
Yeah, who knows what's going to happen when that occurs? I mean, I'm sure Steve's had some experience with these older structures and doing excavation around them.
Yeah, I mean, I would be surprised to see that if we really have much issue, because I think we'd see it on the water side, if there was some major structural issue. I guess on the other side of things, other than the deck falling into the creek, if one of the abutments did get more damage by doing the investigation, what real damage are we doing to the bridge that is incapable of having traffic on it currently?
Well, it obviously it could range anywhere from a complete failure.
That would be a worst case scenario. There'd be an environmental issue with
Then,
stuff falling
well,
into
it'd be
the
an
creek.
environmental issue, and then who's putting what back? You know, is the state now saying, okay, there's no bridge there now, so you got to accept our bridge? Or is the township taking on X dollars more because it's got to rebuild the whole thing?
Now, if I could add to that. The risk, I mean, it should be mitigated by the fact that the scheme that we have in mind is that Doug Bond's office would have a representative here to monitor the excavation. So it could be assumed that if we start to see things going bad, it'll be noticed right away and we could stop the excavation. But the most likely area that would be damaged or fail or blocks fall off is the top of the wall where it's the thinnest. So that'll happen, right, you know, could happen right away. And I think what Steve Harris was saying is just that we need to be clear on the liability and how PennDOT's going to react to that. Because if we end up with a quote unquote unsafe condition, obviously the bridge isn't safe for vehicle traffic, but unsafe to the fact that it could
Becomes unstable.
You know, if they would want it ordered to remove it immediately or a portion of it to correct that problem and or temporarily fix it, you know, there's an expense there. And I think it's more of a clarification. It's not something that would stop the project, but I think we need to be very clear
A
on
definition
whose
to-
obligations are what before we go in. I cannot seem to be very nice to say, oh, you don't need permits, you don't need any special approvals, but if you broke it, you bought it.
Yeah, and understanding what, you know, how much of it did we buy, depending on how much of it do we, if we have.
Right, it's not the end of the world. It's not necessarily something to stop
what
the
are-
project, but
What is the contractor's responsibility?
Yeah. that's the second part of it. What are contractual obligations with whoever we bring in to do the work? And whether they're gonna be bonded and I doubt a contractor is gonna take a lot of responsibility for damage to a already
No.
partially deteriorated bridge that he's just.
It'll be-
Now,
It'll be negligent liability.
right. If he swung the boom around and just knocked the bucket into the wall and knocked blocks out of the wall, that's one thing. but if he's carefully excavating the backside of the wall and it falls into the creek of no, apparent fault of his own, but those are things we would need to have clear.
Are there any, with this kind of an excavation, are there any protocols or best practices or whatever that the township will have to be considering in contracting for the work?
Not specifically for this project, not any more than you would normally have
Okay.
for projects, just we're in a special circumstance. I think, the main thing to protect the township is having that representative from the structural engineer on site to be able to monitor it from beginning to end. I think that's our most important protection for the township. So if something does start to go wrong, it could be minimized, it could be corrected on the spot.
Would our insurance carrier also be considered for a discussion about this at
Well,
that time?
As Steve just said, I don't think that the township's insurance is going to cover the failure, the worst case. There's excavate, do the excavation, the thing fails because it's not secure. The township's insurance carrier isn't going to cover that.
But that's their business. They may be able to direct us on where we can go to get that type of coverage.
It's possible, yeah.
So the question of who bears the risk of loss during this examination that would happen is not something that we need to kind of figure out today for purposes of deciding whether or
I
not we
thought the
want
purpose
this
today was about this.
on the grant
Yeah.
application.
Yeah, but
So-
I just,
I know what you're
I
saying.
didn't mean to cut
Yeah.
you off. I think we have to put the whole thing in context, because as Jim said, what happens if the township gets a grant of 2.7 million and it turns out that it's going to cost 3.2,
Right.
and then just on Murphy's Law, something always seems to, there needs to be a 10% or so contingency built into the
Mhm.
cost. So I think it just is background for that.
Sure.
What could possibly be happen going forward.
Steve Ballack,
Yeah.
can you, would you be able to kind of take a reasonable estimate of a worst case scenario price for this adjusted for inflation, kind of taking the number that was put out in 2016 and giving us something that might be more suitable for
In conjunction with Doug
2023?
Bond, yes, we've already had some preliminary discussions about budget numbers. And to Jim's point, the budget numbers we talked about are I don't want to say protective, but with the understanding that the initial contract might be a lower number with allowances for how much
Mhm.
repair has to be done as you find damage as you go through the project. So we've had some initial discussions. I'll have more discussions with him and try to
Okay.
tie that down to a better.
So the deadline for this is March 15th for the filing of this grant application. Do you think that that's a number that you could reach prior to then, so that if we vote and, if this board decides today that we're okay with this being submitted, that we could just adjust that number as we get closer to the 15th?
I think so. Like I said, we already started and, worst cases, you just err to the high
So-
side without
so
being
what's the
ridiculous.
range? What's the range
I-
that you've discussed?
My recollection is we were in the $2 million range just for the structure itself.
Right.
Not everything that is gonna go around it, not the permitting, not the road approaches and all the other accoutrements that'll be attached to the project.
Yeah, I guess that was and this is from us and what we, as a board, as a township, how we're going about this. The dollars associated with the grant, because right now we're working towards a feasibility, but we're not necessarily working towards a construction design that could go out to bid. Or the permits that would be required also. With those two aspects of the project, I would think that the money's gonna have to come from somewhere. And, having that included in this, the dollars associated with it, assuming that, again, without having the details of the grant, could we even use it for that?
Right.
Like building it, great. It seems like that falls into the realm, but designing and permitting. I doesn't necessarily seem like it would, but again, without the details, it's hard to tell.
Well, in that regard, I think if what I'm hearing is that the number that's going to be produced is going to include the bridge, it ought to be
The project.
itemized, and then the itemization included in the grant application, so that if, for example, the $200,000 or $300,000 is going to take to permit this thing is not covered by the grant or the grant, even if it's granted, then the township knows, okay, we're not getting, the grant's not going to cover the permitting, the grant's not going to cover this, the grant's not going to cover that. So if we can get an itemization to plug in there, I think that's an advantage.
That's a good idea. It could also be whoever's reviewing this could also say like, oh, well, that obviously can't be covered. So we're only going to consider
Yeah.
what is.
That's right. So
Yeah, but-
Most grant applications have like percentage cutoffs. They'll have a 5% engineering, they'll have a 10% permitting, or a 10% contingency, or even 7.5. It depends on the program, but they usually have
Well, that's what's so sort of
specified.
strange about this
limit.
application.
Right.
And the quote instructions, there aren't any that I could find.
Yeah, they did reference I believe the bill that was part of this, or the law, and that is like, this program is just like one little paragraph that says this amount of money is set aside
Mhm.
for this
Yeah.
year. And that's it.
That being said, my understanding is that, the attorney who kind of did this outline for the grant application has been working closely with a staffer in Congressman Fitzpatrick's office. So, there hasn't been anything about this proposed project that has led him to say, no, this project won't work for this grant.
Yeah.
So he's been, from what I could tell, pretty, very supportive.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're all in favor of trying to get something if we can. I think we just want to try to make sure that we got it structured in a way where it makes sense to whoever's looking at it. So we know what we're getting, and making sure that we're covered. Because again, we could bid this out and the bids might come in below it, but if we don't have contingency, if they're running the problems, then
This will definitely be a project that
Yeah.
starts out low and increases with
Yeah.
time.
It's
And- but it'll be designed to be that way, not as a mistake, but with allowances for additional costs.
Again, I'm gonna ask again, I mean, by going forward with this, it still doesn't require us to
Do
do anything.
No.
So if we want to put in a different number tonight, than the 2.7 with some, note about adjusting for inflation as time goes on, we can do that. The changes that Steve talked about on the
Yep.
other paragraphs seem appropriate as well.
Mhm.
Again, if they don't like it, they'll
Yeah.
come back and they'll say, hey, we won't go with this. We need you to change this
Yep.
or add this.
But I think you need the number. I think you need to ask a current number rather than the 2016.
I think when we met, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know, were you at that meeting, Steve, when we met with Doug Bond? And
I never met in
I
person.
know Steve was at that meeting, Steve Gittleman. And I think Bruce Wallace was at that meeting and the supervisors. Wasn't there a number of around $3 to $3.5 million that was thrown out at that time?
My recollection was, I think Doug had made mention of somewhere between 2 and 3, and I made.
You said 3.5.
I've said 4, 3.5 to 4.
Okay, so what's the problem with putting down 3.7 million that we're requesting?
I
mean,
don't
I
think
guess
there's any. Yeah.
With adjustments for inflation, as long as this takes to go forward.
I mean, I don't think there is. I think it's just what number is that? Because, again, if we're going after it, go after it for what we
But then
need.
put 4.
I
If
mean,
that makes you more comfortable.
I like Steve's idea of a little bit of a breakout because, my idea of that number of 4 included construction and whatnot. But at least, if we put it in there as a,
How do we do that by the time frame?
well, I guess if we,
The answer, I guess we have to look down at the other end of the table.
Yeah.
As to
Well,
whether it's, I mean, this has to be, as I understand, submitted on Friday.
Yes.
So as a practical matter, if we don't have this thing finalized on Monday, it isn't going to be submitted on Friday. And so the unfair question of the day is whether Steve thinks he can get together with Doug and come up with that.
I'll certainly reach out to him tomorrow or
I-
email him tonight, tell him I need to talk to him.
Yeah, 'cause
tomorrow.
we've got-
The answer is
I'll do
that it will be better if we can do that. And if we can't, then
What's
put
the
in,
alternative?
put in 3.7 or 4.
Well, I guess can we, for the purpose of this meeting and, approving an action, being that I don't think we typically go through the details of a grant application. We say we're going to apply for one or not as a township.
Mhm.
So we can all agree here that we're going to, yes, move forward with this, with some of the corrections that you had noted. And with, I guess, a holdover of a dollar value we come up with here, unless Doug and Steve come up with a more refined number before we have to.
Yeah, I think
apply.
that's
I don't
that's
think we need
appropriate.
to hash out all the details. We just need to know if we're going to apply or not apply.
Right.
Right? Okay.
Now-
May I ask a question before we go to, whoops? Great.
That-
I'll just
uh,
leave
you
that
tur-
out.
Why don't you go up there and ask the question?
No, it was, you turned it off. It was on. There you go. You're
There
on.
we go. Is this just for the rehab bridge or just for clarity? Are we including the cost of a temporary bridge?
This would just, in my understanding, this would just be for actual rehab because the structure,
Okay.
this program
So
seems
it
to
was
be for
just for
like permanent.
clarity. And secondly, may I ask that when you do the breakdown with Doug Bond, that I actually did at home last night download about the HUD grants. I believe you're going to need an experienced grant administrator,
Well,
project
that would be
manager.
part of,
So I'm just gonna ask that we don't forget to add
make
that
sure that
in.
he adds that in there.
Yes.
So I guess based on that, I would make a motion that we apply for this grant with a holdover number of 4 million, unless Doug and Steve come up with a more refined breakdown and include Steve's comments that he had on the language.
I'll second.
All right, discussion?
The only discussion I have is, does that, as I said at the beginning, and maybe this is a separate item, but I believe that Ms. Bauer is planning to send that with the letter of March the 1st that she had drafted. I looked at the letter. I didn't see a problem with it. I didn't see that it committed us to anything. But I think that whether it's part of this motion or a separate motion, we need some guidance as to whether or not that letter will be submitted.
Well, I guess with regards to the letter, because they're letters of support for the grant application.
This is a letter that she drafted for to Representative Fitzpatrick. She dated it March the 1st. It says the supervisor's right to request, blah, blah, blah. And then it would be signed by either you as the chairman or Terry as the
Oh, okay.
the township
It's
manager.
not one of the supporting. Support.
No,
letters.
it's the-
It's the language for us saying, hey, we
Yep.
want your support on this grant.
Exactly.
All right. Well, if there's no discussion on the grant itself,
I don't have any of those.
all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Now, I guess on the topic of our letter to go along with the grant, actually requesting Congressman Patrick's support of this.
Again, I reviewed the letter. It starts out by saying, the Board of Supervisors of Tinicum Township right to request and strongly support federal funding for the Headquarters Road Bridge project, which is currently included in the tip, et cetera. Then it talks about we understand that the Congress grants these awards to the community. It talks about the Headquarters Road Bridge being and contributing resource to the Ridge Valley Rural Historic District. It talks about Tinicum Creek being EV and part of the Delaware Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and that the township wants to preserve history. And the existing plan is to demolish the existing bridge and replace it with a new bridge, and that would be harmful to the historic nature of the district. And it says, please do whatever you can do to get this grant approved. So I didn't see anything in there that it was somehow tying the township into, yeah, we've agreed to accept the bridge and execute the resolution with PennDOT. So at least on the surface, I seemed to me that it was pretty neutral.
So I guess when this gets sent in, it could have a simple cover letter from Terry. Enclosed, please find, and then it could include this letter, which could come from the board, and then the application.
So do we need a motion for that, Steve?
Yeah, I think it would be, yes, I think it would be helpful that the township would authorize, I guess, Jim to sign the letter that has been prepared by Janine Bauer to accompany the grant application.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Should we also consider now reaching out to our state elected officials, asking for them to write letters in support of this application?
Yep. I would make that motion.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. I guess with public comment again. Well,
Public
go ahead.
comment?
Sure.
Sorry, and then you can go. Steve? Do we need to prepare a resolution for the next meeting that memorializes this?
No.
Possible.
That's just it's going to be the minutes of the meeting that memorialize this.
Thank you.
Any comments? Seeing none? I'll make a
Mike?
motion.
I have two very
okay.
quick things that I got today. Do I assume that the township has no interest in participating in residential assessment appeals? 2 have been filed. They're talking, the school district wrote me today and said, we want to settle this thing. One would reduce the township's tax intake by $92.23. The other one will be about $200. Normally, the township doesn't get involved. So I propose, unless somebody is objecting, to write to the school district and say, the township doesn't intend to be involved in residential assessment appeals. And if you want to settle it, settle it.
I'm okay with that.
I'm
Okay.
as well.
And number 2, for those who are interested, the county solicitor wrote today on the question of when the end of the new substituted tax collector's term is up, and concluded that because there's the joint resolution that it is December 31st, 2025, which is what I had written the board anyhow, but this confirms it after discussion, because the township has received 2 inquiries about whether there's somebody could be appointed now, but the answer is no. They will serve until the end of the term.
Well,
Those are
thank
the
you for
only
that,
2
Steve.
things that I had.
Thank you.
If no one has any other questions for me, I do have to go to
Thank you
another,
for
being
another
here.
special
Thank you,
meeting.
Okay.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
All right, I make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion, meeting adjourned.